When we interviewed Prime Minister Keir Starmer last week, we got a lot of questions from our audience asking us to ask him why he's funding the defence uplift by cutting international aid. In fact, quite a lot of the questions that were submitted specifically mentioned an alternative plan of funding this via a wealth tax. The thing is, our audience aren't the only ones pushing this. Tax Justice UK wrote an open letter to the PM, signed by over 138 charity and non-profit leaders, demanding that the aid budget not be reduced, and defence spending instead being paid for by an increase in taxes on the rich, specifically a wealth tax. So it's worth asking, what exactly is a wealth tax? How would it work? And why don't Labour seem all that interested in implementing it? Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Now, when it comes to the defence uplift, it's fair to say that it's by no means cheap. The IFS predicted that bringing defence spending up to 2.5% from the current 2.3% would cost the UK an additional £6 billion annually. That might not sound like much in the context of a £1.2 trillion budget, but defence spending has already risen by about £11 billion since 2022, and taking it up to 3%, which is where Starmer says he wants it to be by the next Parliament, will cost many more billions. Anyway, Starmer's decision to fund this via cuts to the international aid budget is likely simply to avoid political arguments about where else the money could come from. It's unlikely the Tories or Reform would complain about this, and they haven't. And whatever your thoughts on the morality of cutting foreign aid, it's true to say that the decision for the £6 billion to come entirely from this department keeps it somewhat clean for Starmer, who's presiding over a truly perilous economic situation at home, and has already taken serious flack for his decision to tax farmers and to means test the winter fuel payment. Nonetheless, cutting foreign aid will be both terrible news for poorer recipient countries and do yet further reputational damage to the UK's international reputation and soft power, which is why some people have started looking for other sources of funding. As we previously mentioned, our audience and a number of organisations have pushed the Labour government to, instead, fund defence via a wealth tax, something the government has not yet commented on. On the surface, this seems odd. After all, Labour is a left-wing party, and taxing the richest in society in order to resolve economic problems seems like an obvious position to take. To understand why they haven't, we need to understand what a wealth tax is and how it could work. Essentially, a wealth tax does what it says on the tin. Taxes wealth held by an individual. Wealth taxes add up the value of all assets held by an individual. This might be your property, any stocks you own, and savings like your pension, and then ask the individual to pay X% on any value over a certain threshold. It's rare, for instance, that wealth tax proposals for the UK set thresholds below around £500,000. If your assets weren't liquid at the time, the government would likely allow you to make your own decisions about exactly which ones you'd want to liquidate in order to pay the tax, and give you some time to do this. Importantly though, your wealth being tied up wouldn't be an acceptable excuse for not paying. Wealth taxes are generally pretty popular because, in theory, they don't discourage work like income tax does, and they take money from those with the most to give, namely people sitting on massive piles of money. They're especially popular in the UK because wealth inequality is so stark. For context, the top 20% in the UK own 63% of all wealth, while the bottom 20% account for just 0.5%. Things have got far worse in the past 8 years or so. This means the UK's wealth distribution is far more unequal than its income distribution, which is what commentators usually focus on. For comparison, the top 20% of earners account for 36% of all income, and the bottom 20% account for 8%. Anyway, when polled on the idea, the British public usually respond positively to it. Back in 2023, 53% of respondents said that they would back a 1% tax on wealth over £500,000. When higher thresholds were posed, support only rose further. So why doesn't the government just do this? Well, unfortunately, recurring wealth taxes just don't have a great record. According to the OECD, wealth taxes are usually far harder to administer and bring in far less money than expected, which is why they've become less popular over the past few decades. In 1990, for instance, 12 OECD countries had some sort of tax on net wealth. That number had fallen to just 3 in 2017. There are a number of reasons wealth taxes don't work as well as you might assume. For starters, measuring wealth is far more difficult than measuring income, and the super rich often find ways to hide or undervalue their assets. Second, to make any wealth tax politically palatable, you have to have exemptions, and these are usually ruthlessly exploited. In the UK, for instance, you'd presumably have to include some sort of exemption for cash-poor pensioners living in big, expensive houses. But you can imagine how much more difficult this would make the Treasury's job. However, while recurring annual wealth taxes don't have a great track record, in 2020 a report from the Wealth Tax Commission found a one-off surprise wealth tax might sort of work. There are a number of advantages to a one-off tax. If it's done without warning, rich people won't have any time to hide their assets or take steps to avoid it. It could be done without exemptions, so that it couldn't be exploited, but payments could still be deferred to avoid bankrupting asset-rich but cash-poor people. If it's credibly one-off, it also wouldn't affect future behaviour, unlike an annual tax, which would encourage people to either spend more or move their money offshore. Anyway, according to the report, a one-off wealth tax payable on all individual wealth above £500,000 and charged at around 5% would raise around £250 billion, while a similar tax for only those with more than £2 million in assets would raise just over £80 billion. Now, obviously there are some downsides. Some people see wealth taxes as a form of double taxation, given that wealth is usually accumulated by saving income. Although the UK already has taxes for specific forms of wealth, like capital gains tax, which we don't generally object to. Some people also think one-off taxes are unpalatably unpredictable, although again the UK has imposed one-off taxes before, and they've worked out alright. So it seems that, despite some downsides, a one-off wealth tax very much could work in the UK, and would bring in more than enough to cover the defence spending uplift. Whether Starmer actually wants to fight this political battle, though, is another question entirely. Like a lot of things, this whole situation is very much in a state of flux. With Trump breaking international alliances and fundamentally changing geopolitics, the world has certainly felt more stable. Every day we're faced with weird headlines from Trump's trade war with Canada and Mexico, and Elon's not quite so efficient Department of Government Efficiency, or Trump declaring war on Mars to try and regain some international allies. Okay, that one might not be real, but we do dive deep into the chaotic world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our series where we explain everything that's happened in the land of the free. With Trump behind the Resolute desk, the number of WTF moments only looks likely to increase. Unlike some of our other series videos, the tone of WTF USA is more light-hearted, and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. If you're interested, WTF USA can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also the home to other uplifting content, including the new series Abolish Everything. This comedy panel show sees comedian abolitionists roast a pet peeve they want banned from society, while a panel of improvisers dubbed the political establishment argue on behalf of the status quo. It's a lot of fun and genuinely a hilarious new show from the Wendover team. If you didn't know, Nebula is an independent creator-owned streaming platform that specialises in thoughtful content from creators like Wendover Productions, Neo and Real Life Law. It's not just WTF USA either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they even land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click our link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $36 for a year or $3 a month. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.